During the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish women were conditioned by strict limitations which reduced their presence to the domestic space and limited their public lives. The ideal woman would be limited to her role as wife, mother, daughter, or sister, and would not participate in any issue beyond the domestic sphere. For instance, Luis Vives, despite generally defending education according to his humanist beliefs, considered that for young women, kindness, honesty, and tasks which would be typical of their gender would suffice. The effort to isolate and confine women was mainly because the family honor, the foundation of the social organization, was based in women's sexual behavior. Therefore, women were subdued to strict vigilance, which assured the maintenance of an impeccable public reputation. The dishonor of a woman in the family would bring about the fall into disgrace to all its members, who need to clean their honor. In many occasions, simple suspicions of a defamatory lie would suffice to condemn the woman to social ostracism, a forced marriage, or death. The more confined a woman was and the more limited the appropriate activities for her gender were, the easier it was to control her movements and ensure her honor. In this context, women's intellectual education was not only not a priority, but was discouraged. It was much more important to teach young girls how to sew, embroider, or cook than to read and write. Learning how to read would not necessarily imply learning how to write either, since the goal of the former was to facilitate access to religious writings. Many moralists showed concern about the possibility that this method would provide women with access to knowledge. In fact, prestigious authors mocked the model of the smart woman, considering it something ridiculous. In this context, female writing was perceived in the worst cases as a threat to the established order, and in the best cases as a minor contribution to the world of writing. Writing was for many women a heroic act. By writing, women revolted against what was expected from them and automatically became suspicious and exposed to the cruel scrutiny of a cultural universe that was not ready to embrace them as new members. The discrimination suffered by women in the access to writing was evident. Similarly, their works were judged in the light of critical prejudices. Despite everything, many women managed to overcome the difficulties and write for themselves. Some succeeded in even more difficult things. Publishing, offering their texts to the public, represented their place on the stage, and achieving the recognition of contemporary and future readers. Despite the opinion of some critics, there were a considerable number of female writers in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Hispanic world. Many of their works, from all the genres, literary and non-literary, have never been published or received critical attention, which has condemned them to oblivion. A considerable number of the women that wrote them were nuns, writing their works from convents. Conventual writing covers a huge variety of genres: poetry, history, biography, diaries, drama, letters, novel, and even travel books. This is the case of the text entitled Fundación del Monasterio de Capuchinas de Jesús, María y José de Lima, written by the mother Maria Rosa, abbess in the convent, and edited by Sor Josefa Victoria. It is a chronicle of the foundation of the monastery of the Capuchinas de Jesús, María y José y Lima, which also includes the narration of a fascinating journey to America of a group of nuns who, risking their lives, ventured to the unknown and experienced a variety of adventures. One of the nuns passes away during the trip, victim of breast cancer, which they call in the text Caratán, a quite common illness in convents. This text offers one of the few reflections by a woman of that time about this illness, its treatment, and its lethal outcome. Besides, it includes descriptions of the reception of the nuns in Buenos Aires and Lima, and the parades and religious festivities in which they took place. All these accounts appear in a context which reveal the power of the church in South America as another element of colonial power and control. Also, the female body, traditionally hidden in veils and habits by the semi-strict norms to which these texts were subjected, acquires prominence in this account when the vicissitudes of the journey uncover wounds, burns, pain, and various disorders. These narrations humanize the protagonists and discover a corporeality that is not at odds with their intense spiritual experiences. For many women who longed for reading, writing, and creating, the convent became a paradoxically liberating space to fulfill these activities without the constrictions which married life would have imposed upon them. Convents were authentic literate communities where most of the texts written by women in these 2 centuries were produced. A large number of these writings remain in the archives, unexplored and awaiting to be rescued from an unforgivable oblivion, which has thus far caused those chronicles, autobiographies, poems, and theatre plays, which are of indisputable interest for the study of our history and culture, to be excluded from the analysis of a fascinating age. Moreover, the readings of these works provides us with the fundamental tools to deepen our understandings, not only of how these authors gradually acquire authorship, but also of the complexities of female subjectivity seen through the voices of women themselves. Santa Teresa de Jesus and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz are the main representative authors of female religious writing in Spanish during the 17th and 16th centuries. However, many other nuns contributed to the huge richness of this type of literature. There are many nuns who decided to write from the convent, such as Ana de Jesus, who also compiled off of all of Santa Teresa's works, which hugely contributed to the early spread of her name and work. Another one is Maria Jesus de Ágreda, who was one of the most important mystics of the 17th century. Besides texts of mystic themes, she left numerous letters. She kept a continually active correspondence with King Philip IV, to whom she frequently advised in state matters. These letters offer a huge amount of information about the politics and history of this period, besides illustrating the opinion of a woman on this type of matter, something which was not frequent in her time. Marcela de San Felix, the daughter of Lope de Vega and Micaela Luján, entered the convent of the Trinitarias Descalzas in Madrid at the age of 16. There she developed a plentiful work of which only 1 volume remains nowadays. The author herself, following the recommendations of her spiritual advisor, burned all the other 4 volumes as well as her autobiography. Besides the interest that her works hang in sight, the self-destruction of the majority of it illustrates the huge difficulties suffered by these authors, having to face a world that questioned their writings and the fact that they were produced by a woman. However, it was not only in convents where female writings arose in these centuries. Another woman, many other women, most of whom belonged to the aristocracy, since these were the ones who could learn how to read and write, wrote to different degrees and with different degrees of success. Nonetheless, all revealed the desire to create and the awakening of a creative consciousness, which led them to an activity which was not meant for women according to the behavioral codes of the time. Additionally, we find in this text a challenge not only to social norms, but also to literary structures. While searching for their own creative identity, they managed to innovate and develop their own creative forms of expression in comparison to the prevailing masculine model. María de Zayas and Ana Caro de Mayen are the most remarkable secular female authors of these centuries. In particular, Zayas has awakened a high interest in the literary critique from the 90s, both in Spain and even more in other countries sometimes. While she was alive, she was already admired for the quality of her works, both in Spain and abroad, from very early on. Like other female authors of her time, María de Zayas not only broke down barriers relating to the presence of women in the cultural sphere, but also introduced an original perspective about social conflicts in her novels, which until then had only been analyzed from a male point of view. Violence against women holds a key role in María de Zayas' texts, where scenes with physical, sexual, or psychological abuse are constantly represented in the life of her female characters. Zayas emphasizes the violence by placing the female body in the center of the narration, eliminating the possibility of ignoring those bodies and the abuses suffered by the characters, who are individualized mainly through torture and rape. The impact on the reader is undeniable. Zayas' stories introduce us to a universe characterized by suffocating cruelty, extreme violence, and a sense of paralyzing powerlessness when the female characters are confined, sometimes physically and always symbolically, in a patriarchal prison, which ends up destroying them. And the constant threat around them is portrayed if they transgress those limitations. In the face of this reality, Zayas proposes taking control of language, of women's stories, breaking the silence and transforming pain in a weapon that arises through the act of textual creation. Simultaneously, she reclaims a space both for women who write like her and also for female creativity in general, which was otherwise isolated to the margins of cultural life and condemned to irrelevance and disappearance, like the female bodies in her stories. Zayas constantly defends the rights of women to be educated and to access and take part in the cultural world. And surprisingly, she also became a strong advocate of the intellectual capacity of women. Maria de Zayas admired another great female author of her time, the playwriter Ana Caro. Ana Caro is indeed the most famous Spanish female playwriter of the Golden Age. Very few of her works have survived until today, among which the comedies El Conde Partinuples and Valor, Agravio y Mujer stand out. These comedies reclaim the characterization of female characters and propose behavioral models which are far removed from the passivity of the ideal of a lady at the time. The highest achievement of her works is precisely opening new spaces of female positioning in issues as complex as love, honor, marriage, or friendship between women, which Caro accomplishes by questioning traditional values and subverting the expectations of the public. Furthermore, in her works, she reclaims the female capacity to write and take part in the vibrant cultural life of the time, appealing to the long tradition of female writers as a way of authorizing female creative activity. She's a master of irony and humor, and she reproduces through the graciosos, the gesture or fool in English, of her works, vindications, cheeky comments with sexual connotations, and any other issue which would have resulted scandalous coming from a female author. In this way, she manages to introduce in her text extremely subversive elements. After centuries of almost complete oblivion, Ana Caro's comedies have been represented again very recently in remarkable spaces such as the International Festival of Classic Theatre in Almagro. In this festival, her brilliant plays have captivated anew the public due to the literary mastery and the relevance of the messages. We should not forget that for Ana Caro de Mayen, also writing was a way of living, a source of income, as a document from the authorities of Madrid certifies. This is very important. It gives us a lot of information about how the professionalization of women writers happens in history and what are the implications of this. As I already mentioned, Ana Caro had a close friendship with Maria de Zayas, and both mutually praised each other in various texts, probably being aware that they share common challenges and obstacles in an overwhelmingly male cultural world. We find here the roots and first step of a consensus of a female writing community, which will take a long time to fully develop. Maria de Zayas celebrates her predecessors in her works. They are models of female writers who, from antiquity to the early 16th, early 17th centuries, offer her a framework to place her own work. We cannot end this summarized, very quick journey through the most remarkable female writers of the 16th and 17th centuries without mentioning Catalina de Erauso. Through texts loaded with ambiguity, adventures, and deep emotions, Catalina de Erauso introduces us to the complexities of sexual identity. If there is a personality that represents the fluidity of identity in the empire of the Spanish monarchy, that would be, without any doubt, Catalina de Erauso. Many centuries after her death, she continues to fascinate readers and critics. At her time, she was a real-life example of a woman dressed up as a man who, after being brought up in a convent in San Sebastián, managed to escape. She then starts a surprising journey as fugitive, which will take her to different areas of Spain and finally to Andalusia, from where she will end up embarking towards America, always with a male identity. In America, in the colonies, her secret is almost discovered when she's forced to marry a lady. In another occasion, she loses her job when being discovered in an erotic encounter with another woman, although her identity was not revealed. After experiencing many adventures and risky moments, she's arrested in Peru after being involved in a fight. And in order to avoid her execution, she confesses that she's a woman and besides a virgin, which saves her life. She then returns to Spain and requests the payment of her services as a soldier in America, where she was Alonso Díaz de Guzmán. Her fame became such that she ended up meeting the Pope, and she also wrote an autobiography whose authorship has brought up numerous doubts since it was not published until the 19th century. In any case, this autobiography introduces us to the life of a very peculiar author, commonly known as La Monja Alférez, the soldier nun, unique in her time, and who has inspired endless literary works, films, and paintings. Ana Caro, Catalina de Erauso, María de Zayas are the most well-known representatives of the secular female writing of the 16th and 17th centuries in Spain, but many other women wrote and were successful at their time, even if their time and the effect of a powerful patriarchal system has condemned them to obscurity. One of these women that I have to mention is Olivia Sabuco. She deserves special attention because she's the author of a book entitled Nueva Filosofía de la Naturaleza del Hombre, which is a very complex philosophical treatise which was attributed to her father, Miguel Sabuco, since he claimed the authorship in a letter with the support of Olivia's husband and brother. After centuries of unfair silencing and as a result of arduous research, today we can confirm that the work was indeed written by Olivia Sabuco, whose interest in philosophical topics, which were considered hardly feminine at her time, caused her many problems with the Inquisition. In fact, her books ended up being burnt, and she died in 1622 in a convent where she possibly managed to find her own space to think and create. It is urgently necessary to rescue these writers and to read and analyze their text, excuse me, studying carefully how they can transform our vision of what is considered as the golden age of our literature. Forgotten for centuries, Manuel Serrano y Sanz, among others, started to recover them in 1903 with the publication of Apuntes para una biblioteca de escritoras españolas. However, it was mainly other women, such as Emilia Pardo Bazán, in her collection Biblioteca de la Mujer, who started to rescue these female authors and value their contribution to Hispanic literature in earnest. The interest in these works and their authors increased from the last decades of the 20th century due to the rise of gender studies in literary criticism. Every day, new texts and female authors are discovered, and an increasing number of researchers are dealing with their study. We find ourselves here before a field of research in full growth, which provides those who engage with it the huge satisfaction of rescuing from obscurity figures who undoubtedly deserve a recognition that has been denied to them for centuries. Meanwhile, we keep circulating texts, life experiences, and situations that help us to understand the place of women in history, in literature, and in life. Connecting these texts, their topics, and the way of writing them with the reality of our days should be a priority, because they invite us to rethink the past, the present, and the connections between them, which are not few. And I know that many of part of our public, many of people who are listening to this would like to know what happened with Dutch women in the same time period. And even though I'm not a specialist, but I have been very, very curious to find out and to learn more about this. And it's really fascinating, actually. Early modern Dutch women writers have been also mostly ignored by the International Academy, which is not surprising. But we know that, for example, when they wanted to write, they encountered less obstacles than in other European countries, at least if writing was just a hobby and not a profession. Many Dutch women wrote in these 2 centuries, and we know the names of around 180 poets, female poets, who published between the middle of the 16th century and probably beginning of 18th century. One of them is Maria Wieser. Another one is Anna Maria van Schurman, who writes texts in a variety of genres, defending the right of women to learn. And there is also a very prominent playwright, Katarina Leskaili, who really deserves more attention, like all the others, much more attention than what they have had until now. These writers were mostly members of the upper middle class. Frequently, they came from rich mercantile families. They were usually unmarried and tended to stop writing once they got married. They were not allowed to attend institutions of higher learning like universities, but they could attend elementary schools where they were taught religion and some literacy, some arithmetic, and gender-specific skills like sewing. Education was mainly oriented towards cultivating skills that were desirable in wives. But there was a willingness to teach girls as well as boys to write, which was not always the case in other European women. And there was also perception that teaching the poor was an important thing to do, which wasn't always the case in Europe at the time either. In any case, Dutch women writers have to face ideological obstacles to challenge the roles assigned to them as women in the often contradictory concept of an ideal femininity at this time. Unlike in Spain, women writers felt they had to formulate responses to the public and private roles they were assigned to because of their gender. Perhaps it's time to take a transnational look at women writers in the 16th and 17th centuries that will allow us to put in perspective many of the things that we have been learning nationally about French women writers, Spanish women writers, English women writers, etc. It's time to take this transnational look and really learn about these very important figures who offer us so many lessons about literature, about history, and which is even more important, about life. Thank you very much.